In the summer of 1944, thousands of Japanese soldiers were trapped in the hills around Imphal, starving, exhausted, and slowly dying from disease. Just months earlier, they had crossed into India, believing they could destroy British power in Asia forever. Now their offensive had collapsed. Their supply lines were gone, and one of Japan's most ambitious campaigns was turning into a catastrophe. But just 2 years earlier, the situation had been completely different. Because in 1942, it was the Allies who were facing disaster. The Burma Campaign is often called the Forgotten War of World War II, yet it was one of the most dramatic campaigns of the entire conflict. It began with a humiliating Allied defeat. It ended with a remarkable victory, and in between, it transformed the way modern armies fought in some of the harshest terrain on Earth. Burma, known today as Myanmar, occupied a crucial position in Asia. For Britain, it was an important colony connecting India to the rest of its Asian empire. For Japan, it was the key to cutting off China from overseas supplies and securing its expanding empire. As war spread across Asia in 1941, Burma became a target. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces launched a series of offensives across the region. Hong Kong fell, Malaya was invaded, Singapore was threatened, and soon, Japanese troops moved toward Burma. The British were unprepared. Most of their attention was focused on Europe and the Middle East. The forces defending Burma were small, under-equipped, and poorly trained for jungle warfare. Some units had even arrived wearing uniforms designed for desert fighting. When the Japanese invasion began in early 1942, the difference between the two armies quickly became obvious. Japanese troops moved aggressively through dense jungle, appearing where Allied commanders least expected them. Instead of attacking head-on, they slipped around defensive positions, cut supply routes, and attacked from the rear. Again and again, British and Indian troops found themselves outflanked. Defensive lines collapsed, communication broke down, and soon the retreat began. One of the worst moments came at the Sitang River. Fearing that Japanese forces might capture the only bridge across the river, Allied commanders ordered it destroyed. But thousands of their own soldiers were still on the wrong side. The result was chaos. Men were stranded, equipment was abandoned, and an already difficult retreat became even worse. The disaster opened the road to Rangoon. On March 8, 1942, Burma's capital fell to the Japanese. For the Allies, it was a devastating blow. Rangoon was their main port, supply hub, and most important city in Burma. Without it, holding the country became nearly impossible. Yet the fighting continued. British, Indian, and Chinese forces retreated northward, hoping to establish a new defensive line. But Japanese forces continued advancing. Their aircraft controlled the skies. Their commanders constantly outmaneuvered Allied defenses. And before long, another retreat was underway, this time toward India itself. As soldiers withdrew, hundreds of thousands of civilians fled alongside them. Families crossed mountains, rivers, and jungles in a desperate attempt to escape the advancing Japanese army. Many never reached safety. Disease, exhaustion, starvation, and the monsoon rains claimed countless lives. By May 1942, Allied forces had finally reached India. Burma was lost. Japan controlled almost the entire country. Across Asia, Japanese victories seemed unstoppable, and for many people, it looked as if the war in Burma was already over. They were wrong, because the Allies were about to begin one of the most remarkable military recoveries of the Second World War. The loss of Burma was a humiliating defeat for the British Empire. An entire colony had fallen in just a few months. Thousands of soldiers had been forced into retreat, and Japanese forces now stood on the border of British India. Yet despite the disaster of 1942, Allied commanders were determined to fight back. In late 1942, British and Indian forces launched an offensive into the Arakan region of western Burma. The objective was simple: push the Japanese back and begin the reconquest of Burma. But the operation quickly ran into trouble. The same problems that had caused defeat in 1942 were still present. Troops lacked confidence in jungle warfare. Supply systems remained weak, and many commanders continued using tactics better suited for open battlefields than dense forests. Meanwhile, the Japanese were masters of defensive warfare. Their bunkers were carefully hidden. Their positions were difficult to attack. Routes to threaten Allied supply lines. The offensive collapsed. Another retreat followed, another defeat. And many soldiers began to wonder if the Japanese could ever be beaten in Burma. But while the Allies were losing battles, something important was changing behind the scenes. A new commander had taken charge of the British 14th Army. His name was General William Slim. Unlike many officers, Slim believed the biggest problem was not weapons or equipment. Morale. Too many soldiers expected defeat before the fighting even started. Too many officers believed the Japanese were unbeatable in the jungle. Slim disagreed completely. He believed the Japanese could be defeated. But first, the army needed to change. Training became tougher and more realistic. Troops learned how to move through jungle terrain. Patrols became more aggressive. Strict measures were introduced to reduce disease, which often killed more soldiers than combat itself. Most importantly, Slim taught his men a new way of thinking. If Japanese troops appeared behind Allied lines, that did not mean defeat. Meant those Japanese troops were also isolated and vulnerable. For the first time, Allied soldiers began to regain confidence. At the same time, a revolution was taking place in military logistics. Burma had very few roads. Moving food, ammunition, and medical supplies was extremely difficult. Slim realized that aircraft could solve this problem. Instead of relying on roads, entire units could be supplied from the air. Food could be dropped by parachute, reinforcements could be flown in, wounded soldiers could be evacuated quickly. It was a simple idea, but it would completely change the campaign. One force helped prove that the concept could work. They were known as the Chindits. Led by the unconventional officer Ord Wingate, the Chindits operated deep behind Japanese lines. Supplied entirely by aircraft, they carried out raids hundreds of miles inside enemy territory. Militarily, the damage they caused was limited, but psychologically, their impact was enormous. They proved that Allied troops could survive and fight in the jungle. They proved that air supply worked, and perhaps most importantly, they proved that the Japanese were not invincible. By early 1944, the Allies were becoming stronger, but at the very same moment, Japan was preparing one final gamble, a massive offensive that would decide the future of Burma. Japanese commanders believed they could invade India, destroy the Allied armies, and completely change the course of the war. The operation was called Yugo, and it would lead to two of the most famous battles of the entire Second World War, Imphal and Kohima. By early 1944, the war in Burma had reached a turning point. The Japanese Empire was no longer advancing across Asia. In the Pacific, Japanese naval power had suffered major setbacks. American submarines were disrupting supply routes, and resources were becoming harder to replace. Japanese leaders knew that time was no longer on their side. If they wanted to regain the initiative, they needed a major victory. They believed that victory could be achieved in Burma. Bold, Japanese forces would cross into India, capture the Allied supply base at Imphal, advance toward Kohima, and cut the road connecting the front to the rest of India. If successful, the offensive could destroy Allied plans to retake Burma, and perhaps even weaken British rule in India itself. In March 1944, the invasion began. At first, the Japanese made impressive progress. Moving through difficult terrain, they bypassed defensive positions and pushed deep into Allied territory. Soon, the important Allied base at Imphal was surrounded. Further north, Japanese troops laid siege to Kohima. The road between the two positions was cut. To many observers, it looked frighteningly similar to the disasters of 1942. Once again, Allied forces were surrounded. Once again, Japanese troops appeared to be advancing toward victory. But this time, the situation was different. The Allied army that faced the Japanese in 1944 was not the same army that had retreated from Burma 2 years earlier. These troops had been trained for jungle warfare. They had learned how to survive in isolation, and most importantly, they could be supplied from the air. Instead of retreating, they held their ground. At Kohima, a small Allied garrison found itself facing overwhelming odds. Outnumbered and surrounded, the defenders dug in and prepared for a fight that would become legendary. The battle was fought at incredibly close range. Japanese trenches were separated by little more than the width of a tennis court. Day after day, attacks and counterattacks swept across the battlefield. Artillery fires shattered defensive positions. Snipers hunted for targets, and exhausted soldiers fought for every meter of ground. Further south at Imphal, the situation was just as desperate. Japanese forces launched repeated attacks from multiple directions. The fighting was brutal, often face-to-face, sometimes hand-to-hand. Neither side was willing to give up. But while Allied aircraft continued delivering food, ammunition, and reinforcements, the Japanese faced a growing crisis. Their entire plan depended on capturing Allied supply depots quickly. When that failed, they found themselves trapped far from their own supply bases. Food began to run out. Disease spread through exhausted units, and every week that passed made their situation worse. Then came the moment that changed everything. In April, Allied relief forces finally reached Kohima. The siege was broken. Although heavy fighting continued, the Japanese advance had been stopped. Soon afterward, Allied forces pushed southward toward Imphal. By June, the road between the two positions had been reopened. The Japanese encirclement had collapsed. Now it was the attackers who were trapped in a disaster of their own making. As the monsoon rains arrived, conditions became unbearable. Starving Japanese soldiers struggled to survive. Many died from disease and exhaustion. Others collapsed during the retreat back into Burma. By the time the offensive ended, Japan had suffered more than 50,000 casualties. It was one of the worst defeats in the history of the Japanese army. More importantly, it shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. The first time in Burma, the Allies had not only survived, they had won. And now, with the Japanese army badly weakened, General Slim was ready to launch the offensive that would finally reclaim Burma. The victories at Imphal and Kohima changed everything. For 2 years, the Allies had been fighting to survive. Now, for the first time, they had the opportunity to go on the offensive. The Japanese army in Burma had been badly weakened. Thousands of experienced soldiers had been lost. Supplies were running low, and morale was beginning to crack. General Slim knew this was the moment to strike. In late 1944 and early 1945, Allied forces began their advance back into Burma. Chinese troops pushed from the east. American-supported forces advanced from the north. But the main blow would come from Slim's 14th Army. Over the previous 3 years, the Allies had learned painful lessons. Now they used every one of them. Aircraft supplied troops from the air. Armor supported infantry advances. Artillery provided overwhelming firepower. And deception was used to confuse Japanese commanders about where the main attack would fall. By early 1945, Allied forces reached one of Burma's greatest natural obstacles, the Irrawaddy River. Crossing such a massive river in the face of enemy opposition was an enormous challenge. But Slim's army succeeded. While Japanese commanders focused their attention on Mandalay, Allied forces launched a bold thrust toward the city of Meiktila. This move struck directly at the heart of the Japanese supply network. The attack caught the Japanese by surprise. Meiktila fell, and with it, one of the most important logistical centers in Burma. The Japanese responded with desperate counterattacks. Again and again, they tried to retake the city. Again and again, they failed. Allied air power and artillery shattered their assaults. The Japanese army was running out of options. Afterward, Mandalay also fell. One of Burma's most important cities was now in Allied hands. By this point, the Japanese position was collapsing across the entire front. Units were retreating, supply lines were disintegrating, and the momentum that had once carried Japan across Southeast Asia had completely disappeared. The Allies now advanced rapidly toward their final objective, Rangoon. 3 years earlier, the fall of Rangoon had symbolized Allied defeat, would symbolize Allied victory. As Allied forces raced southward, the monsoon season was approaching once again. If the city was not secured before the rains arrived, operations could become extremely difficult. To prevent that from happening, the Allies launched an amphibious operation against the city. In May 1945, Rangoon was captured. Burma had been retaken. The campaign was over. What followed was one of the most remarkable turnarounds of the Second World War. In 1942, Allied forces had been driven from Burma in a humiliating retreat. Their armies were poorly prepared, their tactics were outdated, and their morale was shattered. But instead of accepting defeat, they adapted. They learned how to fight in the jungle. They improved their logistics. They mastered air supply. And step by step, they transformed one of the weakest Allied armies into one of the most effective. Yet, despite its importance, the Burma Campaign remains largely forgotten today. The battles of Europe often receive more attention. The Pacific Island campaigns are remembered more vividly. And because Burma was fought thousands of miles from Britain, many people never learned its story. But the campaign deserves to be remembered. It was fought across some of the harshest terrain in the world. It involved British, Indian, African, Chinese, American, and Burmese soldiers, demonstrated that even the most devastating defeat does not have to be the end of the story. The Burma Campaign began with disaster. It ended with victory, and in doing so, it became one of the greatest comeback stories of World War II.